Sometimes we tend to forget that Jesus was Jewish. All of Jesus' first followers were Jewish. The Hebrew scriptures, the Bible of the people of Israel, were Jesus' Bible. The Psalms, the hymn book of the Old Testament of the Jewish people, was Jesus' hymnal. And we understand Jesus, who Jesus was, what Jesus stood for, better when we go into the surrounding, into the story, in the people, in the area, and the circumstances of the people, of the Jewish people he was part of, and always, for all of his life, was part of. So we understand better our Palm Sunday scripture when we go and explore deeper Jesus' roots and why they celebrated Palm Sunday. Now think of Palm Sunday as Independence Day times 10. It was Palm Sunday, it was Passover. And Passover was that great celebration of liberation, freedom. People of Israel in Egypt shackled, tied down, oppressed, dominated, put down. Basically, rubbed their noses in the mud or their faces in the dirt. And then through Moses and God's power and strength, they were set free. They are exhilarated, and every time on Passover they come to Jerusalem to celebrate. God set us free. So think of, God sets us free. That's the circumstance. That is the setting in which Jesus appears on Palm Sunday. It is Passover, it's the celebration of freedom. He comes like in a victory parade. But then something changes, because he does not come as the victor in power, with military might, with the sword, wielding the sword. He comes in a different way. What Jesus does is he confronts the powers in charge. And we do not understand Jesus, what Jesus does, if we do not understand the circumstances of the Roman Empire at that time, and of Galilee and Judea, the land in which Jesus lived under Roman occupation. Think of the Romans had the mighty military power. Wherever they went, they oppressed people, they took their leaders captive. So like the old Latin saying, veni, vidi, vici, they came, they looked, and they conquered. And whoever stuck their head out a little bit too far was beheaded. So basically, you were gone. And Pontius Pilate is the emblem of the Roman establishment, of the Roman government of Caesar, the Augustus, the military power. So think of Pontius Pilate as in charge, power. So Pontius Pilate would come how? On a stallion, in military armor, with a sword, with spears, with you would hear him come with the trumpets and with all his legions of army right with him. And think of Jesus on a donkey. Isn't that so different? I think the parallel today I'm thinking of Pontius Pilate, Vladimir Putin, Jesus, Alexei Navalny. That's about how you can see today's power differential in today's society, in today's life, in between Pontius Pilate and Jesus. That's about hitting the mark. And then Jesus comes, and he comes to bring a new world, a peaceable, a kingdom that is different than the mighty power of the Roman Empire. He comes to set the people free. Now, it's a different kind of freedom. In Judea, in Jerusalem at that time, there were very, very different orientations of Jewish people. Some were the freedom fighters. You can imagine them like the flag today, "Don't tread on me." So they were out to get the Romans, and they are called sicariers because they had a small dagger with them. So whenever they could try to stab a Roman and run, just trying to get them out. There was actually a revolt against the Roman occupation in around 163 before our Common Era. And Judas Maccabeus, he was the big revolting. But when you see the difference in between Jesus and the fighting, the military power, the oppression, Jesus is standing in for the power, with the power of love. And that power is non-violent. One of the most important things about Jesus is non-violence. It's the power of love versus the love of power that becomes visible. And in our passion stories, you remember when Jesus was captured, right, in the Garden of Gethsemane, one of the fighters was there. Actually, one of the followers of Jesus, one of the disciples, Peter, took a sword and cut one of the servants an ear off. And Jesus says, that's not the way. That's not the way of God. Non-violence is the way. And in that tradition of non-violence, that's how change happened and how change is legitimate. Think of Gandhi, think of Nelson Mandela, think of Dorothy Day. Non-violent resistance, non-violent power that finds expression, and that is becoming visible in Jesus. The other, and also an aspect of Jesus' ministry, is this servant leadership. So when you want to learn something about leadership, look at Jesus. He's a servant leader. He's not thinking of himself as too good to get on his knees, to wash others' feet, to be right there, getting his hands dirty, actually doing the work, and not commanding others to do it. That's the difference in between the Romans, the hierarchy, the power, the you do what I tell you to do. And what Jesus stands out for is the cost and the price he's willing to pay for his conviction, for what he stood up. And are we willing to pay the price, to be as self-giving, to be the servant leader that Jesus invites us to be? So who is this Jesus? And our scriptures, our Palm Sunday story, we just heard the gospel, tells us several things about Jesus. He's the son of David. That's how the crowd cheers him on. Son of David. Who is David? Well, David is that big king that created Israel as a safe place, as a prospering nation, and protected them from enemies. So Jesus follows in the footsteps of David, but he reframes. He's a different kind of king than David is. Jesus is defying expectations. He's not just fitting in. He's outside the box. He's different. He has a way of nonviolence and of peace. Imagine Society back then, patriarchal, hierarchical, just like the pyramid, up, down. Pecking order was very clear. What Jesus does, he turns that around. He includes women. There were women followers of him. He turns to the children. He invites them in. Those who were suffering and hurting, the foreigners, he turns to them. Why? I think sometimes, why did Jesus do that? And I think, well, Jesus must have known what it feels like to be bullied. Jesus must have known growing up what it felt like to be on the margins, to not belong, to be excluded. Jesus must have felt that. And that's why that was so important for him to lift up. I know this is a radical thought. What if Jesus was gay? Would it take anything away from his ministry, from his love, from his service, from his who he was and how he lived and loved? Who is this Jesus for you? The servant? Is he a prophet who says, and that's what the crowd says afterwards, he's a prophet from Nazareth. Now, who were the prophets? The prophets were the people who said, a better world is possible. A better world is possible. And I think that's the vision that Jesus has. A better world is possible. Jesus is the liberator. He sets us free. He meets us in our longing, in our needs. And Jesus, most of all, is the suffering servant who is willing to pay the price, who is willing to sacrifice for a better world. We tell the stories of Jesus. We immerse ourselves in the stories of Jesus of Palm Sunday. And sometimes they sound so familiar, so old, that we forget to capture the radical, the power that these stories have. The question is, where and how do you see yourself in the story? And will you follow Jesus' example in the story and in your life? On one hand, isn't it wonderful for us to tell the story? We sing, we adore it. And then there is the other side to it. Does that story also lead us into action? How do you follow Jesus?